I consider myself an advocate for racial and economic justice. I went to undergrad with Meg several years ago, and before going to law school, I worked in civil rights advocacy in Washington, D.C. for a few years.
Yeah, you did. So Amy, you're somebody that I think of when I think of the word ally, which maybe is a weird sentence, but I think of you like owning and occupying spaces where you are like marginalized, but also very purposefully occupying and like advocating in spaces where like you hold very dominant identities. Mm-hmm. And one of my questions would be like, when do you remember kind of stepping into those spaces for the first time?
I think it was at Hamilton when I was working with the social justice initiative. So to give some background on that, while Meg and I were at Hamilton, there was a student movement to try to think about how to make Hamilton a more inclusive space for especially students of color, first-gen students, international students. And as you might imagine, that organizing space was led by women of color. And I found that it was an incredible privilege to be invited into that space. I think I had mostly been doing more feminist organizing. It's traditional, like the Women's Center. I was involved with the Women's Center, so I had been involved in some advocacy for survivors of sexual violence. So I think that was kind of my entry point into this organizing space, and it was a really incredible opportunity for me to understand the power of just, I guess, communities coming together to advocate for something that they are personally experiencing, and the ways that there's a different power to sort of being able to speak from your own lived experience of a particular systemic oppression, rather than people talking about how other people experience that oppression.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one of my questions, or like something that I think about, is the challenge of knowing, like the challenge of trying to do anything right, like how to be a good ally is something that I think gets a lot of conversation. And if you were talking, or I don't know, here's a question. Do you talk, because I think I don't do this enough, like how much do you connect with people where like they're kind of new to social justice, to like thinking about identity? Like, is that like where you have to start at like 101 level stuff, where if you said systemic oppression, they would say, what the are you talking about?
Yeah, I think in law school spaces that happens surprisingly often, whether it's classmates who sort of care about issues. I think this is actually very relevant since the election, where you have a bunch of new people who are kind of like, oh my goodness, I really care about all of this stuff, but I don't really know what to do with my energy, which is actually a really exciting opportunity to bring more people in. One of my friends keeps reminding me, she's like, we weren't winning by ourselves, so we need more people under our tent. So I think that I do have the opportunity fairly often to sort of talk with other people who either identify as allies. I don't know that I would identify myself as an ally, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But who are sort of identifying themselves as people who care about social movements that aren't traditionally framed as affecting their individual lived experience in a direct way.
Right.
So I have those conversations a lot also in the context of being a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer yet, but in the
lawyer,
right? In the context of someone who is sort of working in lawyering spaces and lawyering modes, and what that means to bring that level of privilege to social movements in general. Lawyers take up a lot of space. And what it means to be an ethical lawyer, in addition to any sort of more personal identities that I hold.
Yeah. One thing, when I emailed you about like having this conversation, you were like, oh man, I have so much to say on this, like particularly since grad school, or like since being in law school. So like, what has been a big shift for you from like undergrad to grad school, or from post undergrad work to grad school?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is just, I took several years off, so I'm older, I've had more life experiences where I can sort of put together my own personal identity. And I think that there's also just oftentimes when a person of privilege comes to social justice work, there is just naturally sort of a lot of discomfort. I think feelings that we often label guilt that has to be worked through. There's a lot of concern about doing things right. And I think the older I've gotten, the more comfortable I've gotten with myself and my life path, I realize that there's no way to do anything right. Which is not to say that people shouldn't try to do things well or be held accountable, but just like there is no singular model for how to do anything in life right. And so I think that that's freed me up to think a little bit more creatively about what my role is in certain social movements.
Yeah. I when you were saying like as we age, we're able to see that, I think that's just almost an uncomfortable level of truth where it's just like if you think back to our college selves, it's like no.
I know it's a little embarrassing, but you know, the good lessons learned.
Totally. So that's something that I've been noticing in myself lately is when like I'm now able to identify when I feel like, oh no, resistance to what you're saying, and like somebody bringing up like a piece of language that we shouldn't use, and I'm like, and I can feel myself having the scripts of like, they're taking away all of our language. When am I going to be able to say words again? You know, like I use the word dude a lot, and for some people it's a really like gendered term that they don't appreciate and don't want to have used towards them. And that one I'm like, okay, I'm on board with that. You know, like I can adjust. I'm not going to be good at it, but I can adjust. But there are other things that people will say where I'm like, oh man, I can like feel that script of like, this is too much. You are asking too much of me.
Right.
And I've gotten more comfortable just naming that of like, I'm not on board with what you're saying. And that's not a real, like, that's just me. That's just a resistance point that I'm hitting. That's not because what you're saying isn't legitimate. What has been something that like you felt yourself like shift around in the, like in how you're doing this work, or just how you're engaging with feedback, or like the ability not to do things right? Is there something that comes to mind for you that you're like, oh, I can do this now, but I couldn't do it 5 years ago?
Oh man.
Or 5 months ago.
Oh gosh. I'm trying to think, because I think that part of it is just like how you reflect on feedback that you get, right? So I don't necessarily want to say don't take things personally, because again, I don't want to sort of de-emphasize the importance of personal accountability and thinking about, but also like realizing that if someone says, hey, I really didn't appreciate how you did X, I think I've come to realize that I oftentimes have very layered and complicated feelings about people in my life who I really love. And if I have complicated feelings towards other people, it also means that they're allowed to have complicated feelings towards me. And so, especially in spaces where you're working, you know, often on very personal issues and with people who you are friends with in addition to doing movement work with, it's really complicated when someone comes to you and says, hey, I didn't think that was cool, or if you could not do that next time, that'd be awesome. Is kind of understanding that doesn't mean that our friendship is over, and it doesn't mean they don't like me as a person. It just means like, oh, let me work on that, or let me reflect on that. Let me think about how to do that differently. And I think just not sort of taking that as like, okay, I shouldn't be doing this anymore, or I should stop trying. I should actually just, you know, take this as a moment of growth, has been something that I in particular would not have been able to do very well in undergrad, as I'm sure you remember.
I can't imagine I was any better. I mean, I have distinct memories from undergrad where it was like my identity was whatever identity it was likely that I was gay, was just so that there might as well have been a rainbow flag in front of me that I just was like walking around with, and then I would have poked out from behind it occasionally. But like that's, you know, like that's what identity development looks like sometimes.
Yeah.
Ugh. When you said you know, I have complicated feelings towards people I love, so why can't people have complicated feelings towards me? I was just like, oh, such a level of nuance that we're just Yeah, it's so easy to be like, oh no, I messed up, or oh no, I've hit a point of resistance, I should just give up. Like that tendency is so highly problematic. Yeah, I don't even know what to do with that, but I think that's a really, really good point. One of the things that one of the questions that I think about a lot, and that for me, I've heard a lot of beautiful answers, but that are very couched in a lot of social justice language. The question being like, why do you care about issues that don't directly affect you personally, right? Like, you know, I'm sure many people have heard the quote of like, you know, if you see your liberation tied up in mine, then we can move in this together. And I think that's beautiful and believe it. And liberation is a big ass word that like, I'm not able to like go to my little brother and be like, your liberation is tied up in that person. So you have to work together in order to like, you know, like that's just not, it's not accessible. It doesn't feel accessible.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I love that quote. It's on the wall of the clinic here, and I walk by it every day. So yeah, there's a story that I've been telling a lot lately because I'm applying for fellowships, and it's all about like what your story is, right? And so I don't think that I realized this until like upon reflection about where part of this comes from for me, which is from my mother, which is, you know, my mother was a union member growing up when I was growing up, and she like took a lot of pride in her job. She takes a lot of pride in never having been fired from any job that she's ever held. It's just like an important part of who she is to herself. But when I was in middle school, her union went on strike. And I remember her like being super conflicted about it. She came home from the meeting crying, saying like, she was crying that they were on strike, but it was like really scary to her to think that she might be fired from her job, not only because of any economic consequences, but also just for how it would, how that would reflect on her as a person. But we were out there on the picket line every day, and I walked the picket line with her, and it was so moving for me. And she was just like, listen, this is not just about me, this is about all of us. And I think that really taught me that there are some times where like there's a bigger cause out there that you have to be willing to think about. But I think it is more complicated because I think that while there are some parts of thinking about what it would mean to achieve racial and economic justice that do seem a little more zero sum, I don't think that that's a useful entry point, right?
What do you mean when you say zero sum?
Like, I guess like when people think about the affirmative action context, right? Like just for an example, people are like, oh, that person took my spot because you got in. I don't have a spot at college. That's what all of these lawsuits were about. You took my spot.
Yep.
So much to unpack there, which I don't have time to get into. But I guess going back to the idea of like, why do you care about things that are bigger than you? Liberation, I think, is a big idea, right? And I think that more recently I've been thinking about it more in terms of what it means to be human and to express all of our human emotions. And I don't know that this feels any more accessible, so you can tell me what you think. But just like, okay. For myself, like as someone who identifies as queer, I think like there are certain things that I will always feel a little bit guarded talking to like a room full of straight people about, and feel like they might not understand about me, because there are all of these reasons why like my experience doesn't sort of all these stereotypes put upon it, and just isn't quite generally understood, and like what it actually means to like live through that every day isn't completely understood. So there's like a level of guardedness, and so that like I don't think that it like prevents me from developing intimate relationships with people who don't identify as queer, but it is kind of a way that we don't all sort of experience our like full humanity. That's the way that I've been thinking about it. Like, what would it mean if we could just all sort of not feel that level of guardedness for arbitrary characteristics around each other? This is also like not accessible, but there's that book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It talks about like what it does to you to benefit from someone else's pain. Like that's just kind of it's like a sad idea that like, even if I'm not individually inflicting pain or injury upon other people, that like I am benefiting from this system that like gives me unearned advantages. And like, it's not that I sit around and feel guilty about it, but it's not like, it's not a happy feeling.
Yeah.
Just like knowing that people that I love are experiencing these hard things. I guess like that's the way that I think about that quote sometimes. It's like, how can we all like be more human and be more vulnerable and feel less pain and inflict less pain upon each other?
Yeah. I just had a thought, which I was like, I don't know if I've had that thought before. And then I was like, that's a really weird thought to not have had before, which is like, so separation or, what is it called? The fact that we live in all separate neighborhoods.
Segregation.
Thank you. Oh God. Okay. So segregation, which is a particular type of separation, like segregation, upholds so much, like it upholds the system of oppression because it's so much easier to oppress people you don't identify with. And it's really hard not to identify with the person who was like, oh my God, welcome to the neighborhood. This place is great. And we have little barbecues out front in the summer. Like my neighbors, when I moved in, like our neighbors said that. They were like, oh my gosh, it's so great that you guys are moving in. This is awesome. Like your neighbors are all really nice. And like we have little barbecues out front in the summer and get together. So look forward to when the rain stops. And we were like, sweet. And like in my mind, and they're all white people on both sides of me. Some of them are queer, some of them are poly, some of them are straight. And like, that's an awesome level of diversity in and of itself. But like, they're also all white people. And if that was not true, it would be a lot harder to not be like, that person looks like my neighbor Joe, you know, like, and therefore I don't want Joe to be discriminated against. Like how important segregation is in upholding oppression isn't, I've always seen it as part of oppression, but not as like a key piece that like, if that went away, how much harder would it be to keep oppressing people across identity groups? Because the empathy is just like one of the biggest things that I see as a reason people care about this, is because they're like, well, I identify with those people. They don't have to look like me for me to identify with them. I care about them, and therefore I don't want them to be hurt. And if you have never had an opportunity to experience empathy for a person who has a highly marginalized identity differently than yours, you know, it's, I've just never seen it in that foundational level. Fun realization for the day. So one way that I think that some of my feelings around like the language of social justice is sometimes it feels so loaded or convoluted that it actually makes it hard for us to remember like, what is it that we're trying to do? Or like, what is it that we're like doing this workshop for? And you were saying like trying to express it in simpler terms, like in humanity. One way that I've been thinking about it lately, and I'd love to get your take on this, is social justice is reducing or eliminating unnecessary suffering.
I like that. I like that, unnecessary suffering.
Because to me, like,
does that assume that there is some level of suffering that is necessary?
Yes. Yes. Because heartbreak is suffering. I would opt into it. I mean, I do opt into it every time I start a new relationship, right?
Right, exactly.
Like, bring it on. That's not what I'm doing this for, right? Like, I'm doing it for the whole, like, happy, joyous feelings. But, like, I understand that by falling in love with somebody, you also are opening yourself up to a whole world of pain. So, like, vulnerability is in, I would say, most things that we are vulnerable about create suffering, or could be identified as suffering. And I think those are totally necessary for us to, like, experience beauty and joy and whatever. But I don't think oppression is necessary suffering. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really like that, necessary suffering. It kind of reminds me, I'm sure you've heard this quote about how like, it's like defines racism as like, I cannot do justice to the beautiful quote, which talks about like disparate exposure to premature death.
Oh God.
I mean, a little bit different than unnecessary suffering, but I'm gonna try to find this
I
because
think
I
if you
thought it
think
was
suffering's a big word, then throwing death at people would be the next level up.
um,
I haven't
okay.
heard.
I'm gonna find it and send it to you. It's a
Okay.
very powerful quote, and I remember the first time I heard it, I had to like think about it 10 times before I could even start to figure out what my feeling was. But it's super powerful. But yeah, unnecessary suffering, I think it's kind of the same thing because you're kind of like unnecessary suffering and like unpacking what that means. But I think it's easier to sort of understand viscerally what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what's your experience being in racial justice spaces, or like
Mhm.
being very conscious of that? Like, what's
Yeah.
your experience of what's your experience of people saying this sentence? Now more than ever, that is
Oh,
important.
huh.
Have you gotten that a lot? Because I've been getting that a lot.
And related to what? Related
To
to
the
anything?
to the election.
To the election?
Like,
Yeah.
now more than ever, that work is important.
Being an out. You mean people saying that phrase about anything?
Saying
Yeah.
that phrase around social justice or justice issues.
Yeah. I mean, now more than ever. Like compared to what? Like I'm sorry. I have been working through my feelings of being cynical and jaded, which is why my friends are so constantly reminding me that we need more people under our tent, right? Because I just like when I was a first year student, it was right after Michael Brown was killed, and like right before we took our finals was right when they announced that Darren Wilson wasn't going to be indicted. And I was like, all right, well, fuck these finals. I'm going to go protest because that's what I know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like out there with the undergrad organizers, like going to things, like going to die-ins, like thinking about how the law school could respond. Those die-ins are another question. But it was like I would send it out to the entire school listserv and be like, hey guys, I'm like, meet me at this time. Let's go over to this protest. Like, very low commitment. I'm talking like a 2-minute bike ride across campus. This isn't like a heavy lift for people. And like no one would show up. Meanwhile, like now like things are a little more high profile, and it's like I don't mean to compare the two things or the gravity of them, but like the number of people who posted on our like school Facebook group to like bring carfuls of people up to SFO to protest the travel ban. Again, like not saying that like one is more important than the other, but I'm also just like, where have y'all been?
Mm-hmm.
Like this shit is bad, but it's also not new. So
How do you balance that, inviting people into the conversation or into the like, oh my God, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so glad that you're here because you should have been here for months, right? Or years. But like the like, versus like.
yeah, I think part of it is like reminding myself about what my role is as a white person advocating for causes like Black Lives Matter. Like, I think it's easy for me to sort of sarcastically be like, all right, so are you like why weren't you guys there in 2014? But I'm trying to remain in the space of, hey, like this really cool thing is happening. There's a Black Lives Matter demonstration. Would you like to come with me? And thinking of it that way,
Yeah.
it is a challenge. That's like some emotional labor. But I also feel like I mean, like when we have this whole conversation about allyship, that's kind of the thing. It's like, what is a white person's role in the movement is like oftentimes to talk to other white people. I think that's pretty cliche, and I think it's more complicated than that. But I think that that's kind of a space where I can imagine myself as like, all right, cool. Like you're here now. Great. Like, let's go like expand your horizon of things that you care about. And like, maybe, I mean, I was a baby activist once, someone had to teach me. So I'm trying to remember that.
So I agree with you. It's a cliche to 0.01% of us. But like it's a well worn sentence. How do you want to nuance that cliche? Like what do you wish was the and sentence to that?
Yeah, I think that there are some probably echo chambery things that can happen when it's all white people talking to other white people. I recently read a really interesting and powerful letter from an organizer, I believe in the Boston area, talking about the local surge showing up for racial justice chapter. I cannot pretend to speak to any of the specifics of what was going on there. But I do think that like it can't end at just like trying to change people's attitudes. I think that there's additionally like concrete actions that you can take, putting your bodies in public spaces and putting them in like the same physical jeopardy that I think a lot of organizers of color have been engaging in. Like, I think the question that I keep asking myself is like, how can you risk more? Like, it's great to talk to other white people. Organizing is really, really important, but also like in what particular ways can you put your body, your economic security, other things that you feel sort of safe around, how can you put that on the line a little bit more? How can you put your money where your mouth is? I've been really intentional this year about trying to, like, if there's a writer of color or an artist of color or just like someone on the internet talking who I think it's really great. There's this movement now of people putting up their like PayPal links on their Twitter bios. So like if you appreciate what they have to say, you can throw a couple dollars their way. I'm a student, I don't have a whole lot of dollars to throw around, but when I do, like I've been trying to be really intentional about where that money is going.
Yeah.
We don't have systemic reparations, and until we do, I guess I can throw a couple dollars in some people's direction. So I think like talking is important, taking action together is also important. And then like the really important and very difficult work of doing the cross-privilege bridge building. So like, I think it's really powerful to do work together, and the experience of putting your body on the line with people who have different levels of privilege than you is incredibly unifying.
Yeah. I think of like, I've been trying to think more about the inviting people in to the conversation, and then also having a real place where you can say like, damn, I wish these people had showed up years ago. And that those have to be separate spaces. Like that those, when you have a shortage of energy, of time, or of people, you end up having those conversations with the wrong people. Like you end up having the like, why weren't these people showing up, with the people who are showing up? And like, they aren't the ones that are ready to hear that, right?
Yeah.
Are ready to hear that like nuance, or to be like, I showed up, my rest of my roommates didn't, so like can I feel okay in that? Like, because if I'm just supposed to feel bad for not showing up already, then I don't know how to show up now. But with the very real frustration of like, I wish you had showed up 6 months ago. And I just think for me, it's always important to be like, I have my people who I can have that conversation with. And then I have my people who I'm like, no, I am stoked you are here. Like, now is the best time, because 6 months from now will be worse. Like that'll be a worse time for you to show up for the first time.
Right. Yeah.
So one thing that I think a lot of people have ambient fear about, myself included, is if I go into spaces where I hold dominant group identities, I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be like made feel guilty or shameful or whatever. And I think that fear for me, I think it comes from knowing that like, that's likely something I've done to other people, and I don't want it to have happened to me. So it's a very real fear of like, well, I know you probably feel uncomfortable in all my spaces, so why wouldn't you make me feel uncomfortable in all of yours? And my experience has been like, that's not typically how it works. But I think it's a very real fear and a very real barrier that people like experience. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some examples. So I don't know if you know this about me, but I served on the board of our Black Law Students Association, clearly not Black. And the reason that I was sort of involved in BALSA, so BALSA is like, first and foremost, I'm not going to say that, because I think a lot of people, especially at Stanford, see BALSA first and foremost as a space for community and friendship and support while you're in law school. And it just like, it happened that like my best friends were like members of BALSA, and they were all like, just come to our stuff, right? And so I just like became really good friends, and it like people were like, okay, like just get on our listserv. But then like when it came to when we were running for the board, one of my good friends was running for president, and she was like, I need your help to do these specific things. So can we just like have you do that? And so like I felt like I was explicitly invited to step up and like help her with some tasks that she had asked for my help with. And so I think like that helped me to understand like, oh, this is a place where I have explicitly been invited, where I have some particular skills that I'm bringing to the table that I've been asked to share. It's a very different experience, like trying to go into a space where it, you know, you haven't sort of done the groundwork for people to like know who you are as a person, and like to like know you kind of on a friendly level where they actually feel like they can call you out for your bullshit, in a way that like will allow you to maintain your relationship. So I don't know if that really addresses your question, but I feel like just knowing what spaces you are not supposed to be in for certain reasons, like like all the Black Lives Matter organizing that happens in the East Bay, like it will say on their Facebook events only open to Black identified people, not even people of color, people who identify as Black, right? And there's always like this back and forth discussion about like, why is that? Aren't you like X, Y, and Z? And it's just like, cool, like, you know what, like if that's what the organizers have decided, respect it. And there are other meetings about Black Lives Matter organizing that are open to everyone, and maybe that's the space where you engage. And sort of realizing that like that doesn't reflect on me as an individual. It's not like they're saying we don't want Amy there, right? It's just like, no, that's not the point of this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back to this, like the segregation idea of like, if you don't have those relationships, but you want those relationships, and you you see the way to access those as like, oh, I'll go to these spaces where like where those people, which is not the right sentence, but where people are who I want to, like, who I know I don't have access to any other way, like that can be a really troubling thing, you know, like a really difficult thing.
But I also wonder what's behind that impulse though, to say like, oh, like the way that I can get involved in the social justice space is by like going to talk to like these people or like this group, that like, when like in reality I think that there's very often something that probably affects you personally that is a way that you can sort of cut your teeth, right? So we talk about this a lot at Stanford, because like there's a lot of stuff that Stanford as an institution could do a lot better, and like I can advocate for myself as a student and feel really secure in the fact that I know that I'm talking about my experience. Like for instance, we often talk about how the law school could do a lot more to support students going into public interest. That is my experience. I can speak on that experience. I know what it is. There's a lot of work to be done right there. There's also work for me to say like, oh, at Stanford, like there's some like not cool stuff going on with some people who are trying to organize a union. Like, how can I sort of work on that movement? It's like literally right here. But then people are like, so let me explain geographically. Stanford is in Palo Alto, and then right across the highway, I'm currently sitting in East Palo Alto, which is a separate, it's not like a district of Palo Alto. It's actually a separate municipality, founded in, I think, 1980, 1981 on a Black Power platform, incorporated itself as its own community, has a very strong social justice organizing history, and also has a lot of poverty and is now being threatened by, is experiencing gentrification. Facebook is right down the road. So I think that like there is a sense, like when people come for admitted student weekend to Stanford, there's like people who want to do social justice work will say in a very well-intentioned way, like, oh, I just feel like this is a bubble and we're so separate from the community, and how am I going to go do good social justice work? And it's like, oh, like there's a lot in that. Like there's good social justice work to be done right here on campus. Like you don't have to like go to where like the other, however you define that, is in order to do good social justice work.
Yeah. I had a conversation, or I was having a conversation with somebody, because I think that I think it's one of those like both ands that people don't, they think of one or the other. Like where we were in a racial justice workshop and people were like, if you don't have any friends who are people of color, like you need to like recognize that, and then like maybe you need to change that. Like maybe that's something that would like benefit your life, you know, to
Right.
like relate authentically with people of color. And so then you have people who are like, awesome, I need to go out and like find people of color. And I'm like, oh no, like you think the only way to, and they were like, you know, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to engage in racism, like talking about racism. And I was like, no, like
Yeah.
that's not true. And if you approach your relationships with people of color as like, oh, this is how I'm going to know the truth about racism, like, yes, there is some reality to that, right? Like white people will never be able to connect with racism the way that a person of color can experience it, and like will have that lived experience. And like
Right.
go out and seek people in that way. So
Right. But also it's just like, I don't think that any two people in this world, like in this world, regardless of race, have like the exact same take on everything as another person, right?
yeah.
Like, so like the idea that you're going to go out and even like get like three, like make friends with, or like interact with like three people of color and suddenly like have a multiplicity of views, and oh, now it's like, it's just like, no, like people are people, and like everyone has their own take on it too. So I think that's kind of, you know, that's sort of an additional thought. It's just like there's like what are you trying to get out of relationships? Is it like community? Is it connection? Or is it like, what can this person do for me? And I think that kind of transcends like talking about social justice and identity. But
yeah, in a good
valid.
way though. So I know you have to go soon. One of the questions I have is around language, a language piece that you've used a couple times, which is accountability. So what does accountability mean to you, and how, like, what does accountability mean to you?
Yeah. I think that it is a process of reflecting on your work, whether it's good or bad, and sort of saying, what did I do well? What could I do better? And actively like soliciting feedback, like being really honest with yourself, like being vulnerable in conversations with other people when they might be approaching you about something that they think that you should have done differently. And sort of committing to growing and to knowing what you don't know, and to being okay with there being a lot that you don't know. I think that's another thing, like the older I've gotten, the more that I like learn about various things, like studying the law or whatever, it's just very apparent how very little I know about a lot of things.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've heard this like the label for it, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Is that something you're familiar with? So basically, the other
thing I don't know about.
Yeah, I didn't at some point either. But Sam, my business buddy, is like a really big fan of it. So basically, you are likely to rate yourself as more knowledgeable the less knowledgeable you are.
Yeah.
If you are like, I'm an expert in my field, it is very unlikely that you are an expert in your field, because the experts know how big a gap they have, like, and then they don't rate themselves that way. So it's like, don't judge your own test. Is one of the messages. And like, the more seasoned you are, the more likely you are to be able to say, here's all of the stuff I don't know. So what's one thing I was going to ask is like, how do you holding yourself accountable, I think, is one piece, right? And that's the, like, when I feel the icky feeling inside, I will actually examine it, which I think it could in some ways be that simple. But I wonder if there's like, if people are like, because I think a lot of people say like, you need to hold yourself accountable, and some people are like, I don't know what that means. Like, I don't know what it means to do that, because I didn't know what I just did was wrong. So like, you had to hold me accountable in that moment, because I wouldn't have done it had I known it was wrong. So what would your take be on that? Like the idea of holding other people accountable, and then the encouragement that we have towards people of like, you need to hold yourself accountable, but also people not really knowing what that means.
What that means, yeah. And part of it, I think, has to do with like your level of like how you interact with people, and like I think that you can sometimes tell when something is off with someone, and sort of I think knowing that it's okay to investigate that and be like, hey, I'm so curious about the way that you reacted when I did this. Can you help me understand that? And then just like listening, but also just like being really curious. There's a lot of shit on the internet, and I think just like clicking around and like just getting a lot of different perspectives on it can just be really informative. People have written a blog post about a lot of different types of micro and macro aggressions that they've experienced. And it's just like, I think it's just helpful to get a sense of how different people experience different things. And also like, not everyone might have experienced something that you did in the same way. So I don't know if that's super helpful.
Yeah.
But I think just being curious and just, not judging the icky feeling and maybe like leaning into it, as our friend Andrew would say.
So last question.
Yeah.
Like how do you feel about the word ally?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to bring that up if you didn't. Okay, so yeah, as you were talking earlier about like this ally accomplice thing, and I understand so that I think kind of goes back to that quote that we were talking about earlier about the idea of like liberation being tied up. I don't know that that's actually a super useful way of thinking about it. I think that I have just come to really, really prickle at the idea of ally being used as a noun or an identity. Because I think that the idea of being involved in social justice movements means taking action, and therefore it's become more important for me to think about doing good work that supports communities that I'm a part of than to think about being an ally. So I think that you can act in alliance with other people, or you can act together, you can act in communion with other people. I don't put the label ally on myself. And I don't think that it's an identity. And I think like part of that is just like realizing that I'm going to fuck up, and it's like, it's going to happen. And so I think that if it's a useful way for people to think about how they are approaching work that they do, fine. But I think that it always has to go back to work and action. Yeah.
Yep. I agree. I think like I have a list of vocab words, when I'm doing LGBT 101 stuff, and the first one is ally. And the first definition is like somebody who supports and respects members of the LGBTQ community. And then the second one is like,
that's kind of just like being that's just like being a generally good human being, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we have to define things in opposition to other things, right? Like the idea of an ally exists because not everybody is that.
Sure.
And then the second, like, I think that's an accurate definition, but the second part is much more important to me, which is like, to be that, you have to be active. Like you claiming that without action is an invisible identity, but it's also one that like is invisible because it's not in action. Like you're not taking that action around it. So yeah, I agree. I think it's a way better verb than it is a noun.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't think that accomplice does anything different than ally does. That's my personal opinion. I just don't think that it's doing any extra work, definitionally or otherwise.
Right. Like it's still a noun, and it still has that same baggage of like if you're claiming that identity versus people just saying like, no, that person, like I would like them at this meeting because they are very helpful in what we are doing. Like they don't need the noun, right? Yeah. They don't necessarily need to be able to say like, no, they're accomplice. They're an accomplice. They're fine. Like we will get to that conclusion in other ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I know you have to go. Anything?
Thank you.
Any last thoughts?
Yeah. Do I have any last thoughts?
We had a really wandering conversation, so.
We did. I guess I just wanted to kind of go back to the idea that like, with the way that we think about power and privilege and systems and oppression doesn't just have to do with identities that have been assigned to us, but can also deal with identities that we take on. Like when I was talking about earlier, like there's a lot of literature and a lot of thought that has gone into how can lawyers engage with this work in a way that isn't reproducing some really problematic things about the law or otherwise. So I guess like identity is super important and it feels really personal. But I think that just the idea of like, how do you take up space in movements and how do you leverage what power and voice and platforms you have, like that can also come from professional or other assumed identities.
Yep. Awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's great. Well, thanks for jumping on with me.
Yeah, it's really good to see you. I feel like we haven't talked in forever. Good to know we can pick it up like nothing.
Yeah, I know. I have an ever increasing number of friends in the Bay Area, so I might make it down there sometime soon.
Awesome. Well, I'll be in SoCal next year, so you can come there too.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good.
All right.
All right. Have a good rest of your night.
Meg, you too. Bye.